Irrigation is big business in Southern Alberta. And this chart shows how irrigation compares to the other uses in the basin. If you look at the light blue area, that is what irrigation is about. And it's broken up into 4 basins in the south here. The Red Deer subbasin, which flows through Red Deer and then on into and by the special areas. Then the Bow Basin, which goes through Banff, Canmore, Calgary, and on down towards Medicine Hat. The Oldman Basin, which is in the Lethbridge area. And then there's a small chunk of the basin called the South Saskatchewan Subbasin, which starts when the Bow and the Oldman join up near Medicine Hat. The distribution of use is very much different in the basins. You can see in the Red Deer, irrigation is accounting for only 21% of the total allocation, whereas in the Bow and the Oldman, you're talking about 80% of the water that's allocated goes to irrigation. And then you've got a small chunk of it down in the Medicine Hat area. The big difference, though, is what's in red there, the total allocation. You'll see in the Red Deer Basin, the total allocation is like 270,000 acre feet. But you move to the Bow, and it's got 2 million acre feet of water allocated.
What we now know as Gardner Dam, the Capel River Dam, and Lake Diefenbaker in central Saskatchewan. There were always people on either side of the issue. You know, over time, there was a report of a royal commission that was really negative on it, but Saskatchewan and Ottawa weren't done with the project even after that. One of the interesting things in understanding the ultimate decision to proceed, there were really strong community advocates around the project. There was an organization called the Saskatchewan Rivers Development Association that was looking to promote construction of water infrastructure of various sorts throughout this area of Saskatchewan. The primary leaders within that organization were representatives of rural municipalities, advocates for business people in these parts of central Saskatchewan. There wasn't nearly as robust support from farmers. The Saskatchewan government that had agreed as part of the 1958 governing agreement signed with Ottawa to proceed with the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. The Saskatchewan government committed to develop 50,000 acres of irrigation, and the farmers in the targeted area were like, no, we want to stick with our dryland model. This became a really sustained and intractable conflict. Part of the critique that dryland farmers who wanted to persist in dryland farming brought to bear on the project is that irrigation changes the form of agricultural production. It's a really different model in terms of work. It's a lot more expensive. So you may get higher returns, but the investment is also sky high. Who does very clearly benefit from investment irrigation are the firms that are involved in construction. There's opportunity for engineering and construction work that just otherwise wouldn't exist. It can serve to change population distribution in ways that create opportunities for business of various sorts. Irrigation, historically, it's been seen as a really strong economic motor. But farmers who are skeptical often say, but how much actually ends up in our pockets? And I think there's reason to think hard about that question.
The Special Areas Board, it's a provincial crown agency, but it was created in response to much of the same issues that really resulted in the formation and the creation of the PFRA. In the early days of European settlement in Western Canada, you had a federal government that had these grand ambitions to have settlers come and homestead on every quarter section of the West. And that was really in blatant disregard to the recommendations of a gentleman named Captain John Palliser, who, when he surveyed the area in the late 1800s, said that this area was really not, I think his quote was, not suitable for man nor beast, and he didn't think that it should be settled. The federal government, disregard to that recommendation, brought in thousands and thousands of European settlers. And in fact, the irony to me today in what is the current boundary of special areas, our population actually peaked in the late 1920s, about 1929. And we had just about 30,000 residents in this area, whereas today we're barely over 4,000 people rurally. We might be at a regional population of about 10,000 within the area. When you go back to the late 70s, early 80s, when a family farm, they successfully farmed 1,000 acres. And so then now you have, farm operations, not all of them, but some of them might be farming 30,000 acres, for example. That's taking the place of 30 family farms on the hands of one single operation. So I think it's bound to change the landscape in terms of settlement and rural depopulation. Like that truly does have an impact. But I don't know if I would go as far to say that rural depopulation is just strictly a function of farm size. Other natural resource, primary production, oil and gas, like all that stuff kind of feeds into it. So I don't think it's just simply a factor of farm size, but yes, I think it does have an impact. Will it continue to have an impact? I suspect in some ways it does, but I'm not sure.
I was interested in studying the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, in part because I believe in the importance of deliberate state investment in supporting people, whether these people are farmers, whether they're others. I believe in the role of state in contributing to the creation of spaces where non-human nature can thrive as well. I think there's power when people work together through the resources of the state. It's really essential that state investments reflect a really careful effort to consider the public interest and to levy state resources in ways that consider a range of factors. And one of the things that became really clear for me as I conducted my research was that we haven't always done a great job of thinking about what constitutes the public interest in a broad-minded way. And in fact, one of the limitations in conceptions of the public interest that are really evident is the failure of that agency to adequately consider the interests of Indigenous peoples and to accommodate the needs and perspectives of Indigenous peoples. Dealing with that matter, dealing with the specific circumstances of Indigenous peoples in the present, as well as the harmful legacies of the historical operation of colonial institutions, is fundamental to productive ways forward. But I think there's also a broader lesson here about the need to be careful about assumptions about what's in the public interest. I think we also need to be really careful about the goals we think we're serving through these state agencies. I think it's essential we work together, that we use state levers in appropriate and careful ways, but that we think really hard about how we're doing so.
The only way we have been logging since we started logging over the last century is, and we continue to do so, is through this malpractice of clear cutting. The problem, again, with an increase in the magnitude and frequency and duration of floods of all size. The clear cut logging increases the magnitude, frequency, and duration of the small, the medium, the large, the very large, and even the apocalyptic floods. And the larger the flood events, the bigger is the effect of clear-cut logging. Our hydroclimate environment, being mountainous and snow-dominated, is the most super sensitive to that sort of shaving the landscape from its forest cover. In the process, clear cutting end up causing us to lose, based on 30 years of research work, we have lost one of our most natural protection against an increase in flood risk caused by climate change. Instead of preserving the forest cover to mitigate the increase in flood risk caused by climate change, we are actually exacerbating and making the situation worse. And therefore, our actions on the land in the form of policy and regulation is portraying a lack of appreciation of the power of forest in mitigating hydrology and geomorphology.
Used to, when I was a kid, raise tropical fish, and we used a subgravel filter to keep the water clean. And the way it keeps the water clean is water is drawn from the open water where the fish live down into the gravel, where bacteria and algae and fungi process the waste products and turn them into essentially fertilizer for the plants that are growing and are rooted in the gravel. And you can think of these gravel bed rivers and streams as these subgravel filters. And so it's enormously important to maintain their function. Unfortunately, some of the best deposits, of course, are in living rivers and streams in their riparian areas and the gravel beds that are associated with them. And so they're the natural target of industry. They're right open, they're on the surface. You just go down to the riverbank and dig them up and haul them away. But you can imagine that the potential impact of that is really, really large. The gravel miners like to tell us that they have really no other choices. They've mapped all the gravel deposits and they want them all. And that's just sets us up for a major confrontation at some point about whether we're going to have living rivers or whether we're going to have dead buildings made of concrete.
We had suggested that the provincial government look into more is industrial licensing, pricing or rents on the water resource itself. BC, when they reviewed their water legislation, they did put in a water rent, and often those resources generated by that revenue is you can put that back into the restoration system. So that's certainly something that should be looked at. It's a public resource, valuable, essential, foundational public resource that we should be taking every measure to conserve to the greatest degree possible. Usually the costs are related mostly to the infrastructure and pumping that you would have to do as the license holder, but there's no actual resource fee or anything like that. So there is an application fee in that process, and any data collection or information you might need to do that process. But after you have that license, there's not really any additional government-based fees that flow to the government for that resource use.
So unlike oil and gas, we don't have a royalty on water or anything like that.
Correct. Yeah, and I think admittedly it gets contentious because obviously the humans need water to survive, and the issue of how you price water, there's issues around equity and a variety of other things. So certainly we've said, well, looking at licensed industrial uses is different from a human right to water in that context.
Freshwater use in the fossil fuel industry. We use about 220 billion liters a year of freshwater. That freshwater is acquired through what's called a water diversion license. So the industry must request a water diversion license, and that's how they attain their water. For example, this is all publicly available. There's on the AER website under public notice of application. You can look up the last 30 days of water diversion licenses. So for example, over the last 30 days, there were 55 companies that applied for water diversion licenses in the province. We have what has accumulated from the oil sands in tailings ponds. That's an estimated 1.7 trillion liters of water that are sitting in those pools. Again, that's an equivalent to 11 billion barrels of wastewater that's sitting in those tailings ponds. But often the fresh water that's used in the industry is gone forever because that water goes into the formation. So for example, if we're fracking with fresh water, that water goes into the formation to be gone forever. And even if it does come back as produced water, it's then disposed of because it's now considered contaminated. There's 275,000 sites that need to be addressed and cleaned up on the conventional side. And then on the oil sand side, there's 100,000 hectares. So that's the equivalent of 100,000 football fields that have a footprint on the environment and need to help. To me, the key is restoration. To me, the primary way that we're going to address many of these water-related issues from resource extraction is to prioritize restoration.
Give it an A, B, C, or D.
Would you pass this act? Is this something that you feel is sufficient?
No, absolutely not. No. Well, they curb in part, at least for new water licenses, but existing water licenses, there's not much government can do about them. But there's no expropriation power, which I think is quite amazing since government can expropriate private land and water rights are not even property interests. Cancellation power is very limited, only if the water right has not been used for 3 years and there's no reasonable possibility that it will be used. Securing sufficient in-stream flow, where there are a few tools in the act, but they are really quite limited. Recognizing Indigenous water rights and securing water for them. The act does not do that. Securing water for drinking, washing, and other basic human needs. Household use right does have the highest priority. So it does that, at least in part. Regulating water with quantity and quality. No, the act doesn't do that. Conjunctive use, groundwater, surface water. I think maybe government tries to do that when it's consistent with but there's no requirement. Incorporating watershed governance and management. Certainly not formally, although there are all kinds of things like watershed organizations that work towards this. Clarifying rules regarding alternative sources, wastewater, so on, rainwater, and so on. No, but the government plans to add these into the Water Act. Incorporating climate change and mitigation adaptation. Sorry, it does not do that. One thing that we would like to see prevail is the rule of law, and that the legislation should be clear as to what occurs in an emergency, how long an emergency can exist, especially if the government has a right to declare that provisions of the Water Act don't apply. I'd certainly want to have provisions to protect in-stream flow needs, also recognition of Indigenous water rights and ways to meet those water rights would be a couple of things. Climate change provisions. Climate change is not just an emergency anymore. It's a reality that we have to deal with. Grandpa Joe gets to eat everything he wants, and then what's ever left goes to Sister Sal, then to Dad Doug, then to Mom Sue, and then to Baby Bev. What can happen in a time of shortage is the most junior entitlement holder just gets nothing at all. So we have to ask ourselves right now, is this really a reasonable way to allocate water?
Water Act isn't very adaptive. It can't quickly address issues related to shortage. I think that's the rationale for the emergency powers, trying to find shortcuts to deal with issues. Practically speaking, we've seen years where it's been pretty easy to anticipate problems. Back one of the earlier events was a threatened priority call that would have affected, I think it was a meat packing plant on the St. Mary's, and all of the ranchers in the area said, oh, well, if that meat packing plant gets shut down, we don't have anything to do with all our beef. And so you saw the community come together and negotiate an agreement and preempt that potential issue. Again, these are problems that FITFR doesn't really help with. And I think we'll see that again and again. As Arlene said, climate change is likely to result in less water in the system. The Water Act not being adaptive, we're going to have to use other measures. The best we've had so far is negotiated agreements. They've all been voluntary, very little force of law. Maybe with these emergency powers, there will be more, but things need to happen really fast when you've got a water shortage. And we're not very good at making these deals and arrangements and imposing laws quickly, and legislative change takes forever.
What is the resiliency threshold for the Canadian water supply? And I use the word resilient on purpose. Sustainable is what we have today and preserving the ability to meet that into the future. I would argue what we have today is already inadequate. We are already oversubscribed for water licenses in the South Saskatchewan River Basin. We are already in a water deficit. We need to do better than that. Resiliency takes into account the ability of a system to adapt and have adaptive capacity in the face of hazards and how that system is able to recover. And so I think, honestly, we need to roll things back. We need to become much more water focused and water central in terms of our governance and decision making. And instead of just haphazardly building a community within a city in location X because the land is available and it's cheap and there's a developer, say first, okay, well, full stop, is there the water supply? If we're going to procure new economic development and grow in industry, not only in terms of oil and gas, which is the obvious low-hanging fruit, or massive computing facilities, okay, full stop, how much water is that going to require? These are questions that we're not even asking. And that's why we don't have the models to be able to answer those. But honestly, it's the most important factor if we are going to continue to grow our population, to thrive in this particular location, which happens to be some of the driest regions of Canada, and support future generations well into the future with climate change.
The Alberta portion of the Milk River watershed is only about a third of the entire watershed. We have transboundary partners both in Saskatchewan and Montana that are important for us. In 2012, we initiated our second State of the Watershed report, and we said, let's work with our transboundary partners. The core team that we had established in Alberta that had put together the 2008 one, we found out who their counterparts were in Montana and Saskatchewan and teamed them up and said, okay, Alberta's going to take the lead here, but we want to help fill in those data gaps from other areas. We kind of opened the Pandora's box a little bit in a lot of ways, and recognizing, that whether it's a species at risk issue or aquatic species at risk or water quality concerns, they're not stopping at the border. For those that aren't as familiar with the Milk River Basin and the St. Mary's Basin, one of the very first Bureau of Reclamation projects that was completed in the United States was done to transfer water from the St. Mary's River down by Bab, Montana, just south of Cardston, up over the Continental Divide through 2 sets of siphons and really incredible technology. First surveys were conducted in 1903 to 1905 and engineered and built in the teens. Roll formed steel from Chicago that was brought up on barges and then on wagon trains in pieces over from Great Falls. As many as 6 years out of 10 in areas would have had no flow naturally that has sustained flow through the summer. And then in 110 years, we've got an aquatic environment that's adapted to that, fisheries that are very unique that are coming up through the Missouri River system that aren't found anywhere else. Stonecat and Western Silvery Minnow and Rocky Mountain Sculpin, species at risk that are found in the Milk River in Alberta that are nowhere else in the province. And we've got an infrastructure deficit. And in 2020 was the first light went out.
Pigeon Lake is the biggest lake in central Alberta. I saw ourselves as leading in terms of where a lot of the other lakes would be going if they didn't do more in terms of people living around the lake. A lot of people didn't understand that the condition of the lake had much more to do with how we live around the lake. So a lot of our issues was how to take lake community, which included 10 summer villages, 2 counties, and 4 native bands, and help them come together in terms of seeing the lake as something that we can all contribute to the health of the lake, and it can contribute to the health of the businesses. There's all sorts of people that only live at the lake part-time. It's a place for them to bring their families, and it's a recreation lake. So some people saw it as a backyard swimming pool. I was there because I thought, here's a great opportunity for people to see in front of them the consequences of how we live on the land, for people to learn to live with nature, which to my mind is part of fighting climate change, is also making sure we live with nature and let nature do its thing for the climate as well.
One of the important things that as the Bow River Basin Council we look at is that we have very few but larger license holders. So it's a much smaller group than maybe some other basins would have controlling the water, but also that the Bow Basin is the largest contributor to the SSRB, the South Saskatchewan River Basin. So we understand that the challenge of watershed management in our area also affects many other people downstream. That is always something that we're thinking about, not just upstream, but also the downstream users. They get what they're given after we have finished using that water. So it's a responsibility, but something everybody takes seriously. But maybe some of the areas we don't have enough information on might be, how does some of these smaller systems that feed into the Bow, how are they being affected by climate change? And I think the overall question some people might have would be, where is this metaphorical cliff? Like, where do we, if we push the system to a certain level, where is the edge? And I think if you're looking for a gap or something that maybe people aren't really thinking about because everything seems like it's going fairly well, that might be some of the questions that some of our members would have, is with all this, this climate change we feel is happening. We know there's pressure on water. We all have uses for it, and there's only a limited supply of it. How far can we push it before we have some kind of effect on the river that we can't fix?
We're able to control the quality pretty good. Like, we do have our creeks and dugouts fenced off, and we're investing money and continuing to invest money in offsite waters. So that's been really good. There's a lot of programs there to help farmers out. The quantity is our issue. There's a little creek that runs through our place. It doesn't even have a name. And maybe if it had run more often, I'd name it. But the point of it is, when I was a kid, we talked about like the one time the creek didn't run. And now we talk about when it does run. Like, we just received 5 inches of water, whenever that was, like 4 days ago. And the creek came up pretty good. It wasn't running. It came up pretty good. And now you can go and almost like check it twice a day, and you can see that the flow is starting to slow down. And I expect in a week, it's probably going to quit again. So, our aquifers, our groundwater flow supplied by springs. So, and that's what's killing us, is our springs are just not flowing the way they used to be. And that's how low our groundwater is. And that 5 inches of rain, it soaked in there. There was no water laying in the fields, anything. Like, we were so dry, and it could it could give us another 5 inches again right away, and that would be fine.
If I were today to go in on my own and buy a farm, it would be 100% impossible. Land prices here, and keep in mind this is irrigated, but we're I think $22,000 an acre. It's impossible to buy 1/4 of land, and you can't even make a go of it on 1/4 of land. You could if you had very high value crops, but with that comes very high value equipment. For the average young person, that is not possible. The amount of money to buy a 1/4 of land, I mean, that's $3.5 million per 1/4 of land, where you're going to get a down payment to even buy 1/4, never mind, a couple to make it worth it, and then all the equipment costs on top of that. Actually, I've thought about this for a while. I think the industry is going to go to, you see it in a lot of, Midwestern United States, where there's a lot of now corporate farming. We see it, everyone here has mentioned how farms have gotten bigger and bigger. Part of that reason is we got a lot of foreign investment into farming in our area, and we're seeing more and more corporate farming. Farming had a real bad rap, especially in the 90s. It was real tough to make a go of it. A lot of people born, so probably a couple years older than me, but we're kind of coached not to farm and to go to the city and get jobs there. Now farming, I would say in the last 20 years, turned around, especially irrigated farming has done quite well. Farming requires a lot of effort and a lot of work, and a lot of people like the Monday to Friday 8 to 5 jobs, which I guess I can see the appeal to, but it's not for everyone anymore, and there's just a lot of options out there.
What we're seeing is the water table is lower, and the area that we're in, we sit on one of the largest salt beds in the world right under us. And if you get down any lower than, say, 200 feet into the ground for a well, you've hit the salt beds. So we can't go lower when the water table starts going down, because you start ending up with issues of the quality of the water. The sodium is just too high. Matter of fact, the town of Two Hills used to run well water. They had 5 wells that they ran to supply the town. They had to shut it down because of salt. Yeah, the good supply. Doctors would recommend anybody with high blood pressure not to drink the water locally. We treated it, but just couldn't take enough salt out of it. So now they get City of Edmonton water, which brings up another issue in my mind is we have the city EPCOR supplying all these towns going out for hundreds of miles now. We saw what happens in Calgary when part of the main water suppliers go down. And so it's always an issue out here too. We worry about that. Farming wise, like you say, we're very dependent on the rains. If we need sprayer water, we will be going to the towns and we use that clean water there. And I think frackers are starting to use some of our water too. It's what I'm starting to see, because there's no dugouts. There's nothing to really suck it out of, no sloughs.
Climate change is obviously a very big part of the push towards the electrification of the global economy. Climate policies play a big role in that. And so we bring both a global perspective and also a local perspective. We do a lot of work, as you mentioned, oil and gas liabilities, that sort of thing. So I'm very curious to know what Derek thinks about risk and climate change, because risk is a word that is entering into our conversations more and more frequently. And most importantly for your viewers and listeners is our refusal to grapple with risk, to acknowledge and accept the fact that risk is increasing, and we don't want to be forced out of our comfort zone. There are changes that are taking place at the global level in the reinsurance industry, and then in the larger industry as a whole, that are going to play a role in what insurance costs and when it'll be available and to what degree. That has nothing to do with Alberta.
There has been some high profile global companies pull out of the energy business or anything that goes below ground or related to pipelines. But it is still available, although recently I have read where pressure is still being brought to bear, particularly in the London, England market, which is the world center of insurance, where environmental groups from the UN are bringing pressure to bear on the remaining companies that are offering that coverage and saying, either phase it out or get out and put these companies on the spot. In most commercial policies, there is what they call an absolute pollution exclusion. It's where any sort of release of material especially if it's ongoing, is completely, any damage from it is completely excluded. You can buy limited, and this is, keep in mind, this is limited coverage. In many cases, it's limited to $250,000. It's time to treat water like the valuable resource it is, and I think we're getting to a point now, and I remember saying this to my wife, gosh, it must be 20 years ago or more now, that fresh water is going to become the new oil.
Where the decisions being made that a pipeline needs to be developed. That's not happening from a development standpoint. There is not a group of geoscientists and engineers and professionals and oil field workers that are saying, we need a pipeline to China. These decisions are coming out of a corporate headquarter office and being pushed through stakeholder relations teams, which don't necessarily have a safety first, a risk first mentality. It's rather a relations and business development mentality. That's the first hurdle that we are struggling as a industry, is that we are not starting these decisions from a place of what are the opportunities and what are the risks to those opportunities, and should we be even exploring that, or should we be just simply closing sites and cleaning up our mess and helping expand the renewable rollout?
This is a fundamentally difficult, maybe impossible conversation for humans. Only a very small fraction of them seem to be willing to actually change their behavior today to not only stop the growth of these land uses, but how do we put money and effort and time into reclaiming them so that we might have streams in the future, which are the ones that our grandparents talked about putting their kids in, or drinking water that is not treated chemically or physically, or being able to see the suite of wildlife. We've lost 96% of our native wildlife. Native mammals and birds are very similar. Insects, we really don't know. So we're sitting with a grade of F- right now. Maybe we want to reclaim it back to a C. Where have you seen successes in terms of people being willing to, first of all, talk about these non-palatable trade-offs and be able to actually do something about it? Where I've seen communities with tremendous commitment actually doing something would probably be the Akoli region of India, where I worked for a bit, in an area that allowed all their land uses to grow, particularly fueled by more water, because they, over the previous decades, had discovered the ability to drill their aquifers. So it was an area that was basically low intensity agriculture, sustainable, been going on for probably thousands of years. And then foreign aid from Canada and Europe and the United States came in and said, hey, you know what, if you guys could just start using boreholes, you'd be so much better off. So tens of thousands of boreholes go in, food production goes up, population explodes, youth survivorship explodes up. Populations are growing now at 4 and 5%. Aquifers get drained, crops fail, people starve. When you're starving, you'll eat whatever's around. They ate everything they could. Vegetation was gone, no vegetation. The soils got eroded and it went back to rock. And then it was in the aftermath of that I was and others were invited in to look at that. And I saw people committed to doing something. And I thought, wow, I couldn't imagine a more blunt signal, like basically everyone that anyone knew is dead. My goodness, these people were committed. Now, at this point, they're dealing with rock. They wanted rock to turn into soil, and they wanted soil to turn into vegetation. And they thought vegetation could be eaten by humans. And man, they are working. They have people out on the ground working with particles of soil just to try and move this particle here so that maybe a water droplet might stay there for 6 seconds, not 2. I saw immense commitment. I'm stunned at how bad shit has to be before anyone seems to go beyond rhetoric and want to do something about it.
The major consumptive water uses in the southern prairies are irrigation and potash mining, solutional potash mining. In Saskatchewan, by far the largest consumptive use of water is for potash mining. In Alberta, of course, it's irrigation. And as a result, the water level record at Medicine Hat, the flow of the South Saskatchewan River at Medicine Hat has been declining quite a bit. But most of that is extraction of water for irrigation. Some of it is the wastage of the glaciers. The major loss of water under natural conditions is evaporation. We have a large amount of evaporated water loss. If our summers get longer, they don't necessarily have to get hotter, but as they get longer, there's more days of net evaporation. We expect in the future and that we'll have evaporation, for example, in May and September, even April and October, whereas historically the temperature has not supported much evaporation.
That makes so much sense. Like just the other day, we had massive Chinook winds. I just kept thinking there's so much water that must be leaving our system. Whereas normally we would be receiving snow and we'd be actually gaining water. That's the alarming piece.
The loss of water during Chinooks is most obvious when there's snow on the ground. They call it a snow eater, right? The snow just sublimates it. But we are observing longer frost-free seasons. Especially, it's not so much getting hotter, it's getting much less cold.
Right.
Our winters are much less cold than they used to be. Climate hazards, climate change, climate variability, extreme events, they're a problem only if people are exposed to them. In fact, the entire concept of risk is at the intersection of the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Climate hazards can exist, but only if you're exposed and vulnerable to them will you suffer. And there are ways that we can limit our exposure and vulnerability. That's the whole purpose of adaptation, is to limit the exposure to climate hazards, is to reduce the risk or avoid the risk altogether. Those two basins, the Old Man and the Bow, are the only two river basins in Canada that are considered fully allocated.
When I was in the legislature, it was a very serious matter to consider transferring water from one basin to another. Bill 7, many of the changes are said to improve water security, but they benefit a few large industries over in-stream flow needs. Maintaining some kind of flow that will protect species within the river. We should not be transferring water from one basin to another. And Bill 7 is going to make it easier for both the legislature to pass such a motion if they were even going to address the issue, because they wouldn't have to address the issue if this new bill goes through. It would be ministerial discretion. The other side of this, though, is my concern about the massive expansion of irrigation in Southern Alberta when we're already not meeting basic water conservation objectives in the South Saskatchewan Basin. It's appalling that the irrigation industry has managed to, without any major consultation with Albertans, extracted significant funds, up to almost $800 million from federal and provincial bodies, to expand by up to 500,000 acres in Southern Alberta the irrigation potential. No public debate, no public input. In some cases, no environmental impact assessments. They're planning 10 new reservoirs or expansions of reservoirs. And as I say, based on their calculations of saving water through canalization as opposed to open dikes, they feel they can meet the objectives of massive expansion of irrigation just through those savings. And there's very little evidence that we've seen that's going to be successful. Allowing that expansion and then transferring from the north to the south, not only is it extremely costly, but many more risks are involved than I think we've been led to believe. Water conservation objectives relate to 45% of natural flow, and that's one indicator, which we have not been meeting again in the South Saskatchewan River. And in-stream objectives are even more minimal flows in the creeks and rivers that we, in many cases, are not measuring and not enforcing. We need to properly fund Alberta Environment to enable it to do adequate monitoring and put in place some accountability when these flows are not supporting life in the rivers and the creeks.
How we report to the public, and then on the back end, how we manage the landscape for these variety of very challenging, admittedly challenging areas of water quality and diminishing water quality, whether it's nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen or other more targeted pollutants coming from the landscape or point source emissions or wastewater streams.
With the oil sands, if there was a major breach, do we have a plan in place for those types of things?
There's probably a variety of emergency plans that are sitting there, whether they're fully operational if an incident actually happened. For sure, there's been very large dam breaches in the recent past, both in BC and Alberta, in the OBED mine, for instance. So I think an ongoing challenge for sure is there's a high risk. We try to mitigate those risks in terms of having regulatory standards in place, but we've seen witness to those bigger issues failing and resulting in these big incidents. So the long-term planning and monitoring and compliance issues are kind of key there in terms of ensuring the safety of downstream communities for sure.
Cannot separate the water from the living system, but we do it all the time. We look at water as a resource that we can pull out of a river or withdraw from a lake and use it, put it to our use without understanding how that's impacting the river. So one of the fundamental measures of health of the aquatic ecosystem, including the riparian ecosystem, is the flow. We do constant flow monitoring from a couple of dozen flow monitoring stations in the South Saskatchewan River Basin. We do keep that data. The problem is that we are shrinking the rivers. So we're measuring their demise. We know that we've down in Medicine Hat, which is below the confluence of the Bow and the Oldman, the mean summer flow is now 30% less than it was when we started keeping flow records in the early 1900s. In Lethbridge, along the Oldman River, we're closer to 40%, 50% less flow during the prime irrigation season than would have happened naturally. Our apportionment agreements with Saskatchewan require we pass 50% of natural flow. So we have to calculate what the natural flow would be in order to understand if we are meeting our apportionment agreements. I've been puzzled that we don't have water quality, at least total dissolved solid monitoring on a continual basis as we do monitor the flows. We could set those up together. And the amount of sediment you have in a river tells you a lot about the water quality. There are a lot of gaps, Jenny. It's very hard for us to get a handle on trends in water quality in the rivers of the South Saskatchewan River Basin.
Predominantly, our water management system is very Western science based. It's very much this value, this water quality parameter needs to not cross this threshold. There are development of both Aboriginal flow needs that are actually part of the legislation up in the Peace Athabasca area, or the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, I believe, has Aboriginal base flow or extreme flow requirements. So it's entering into the conversation, but again, most of our discussions about what data we need to collect are really, really heavily based in Western science methods. So that's a gap, I think, initially. We do need to be working with partners, Indigenous communities that have different forms of data that can be used in this decision-making process. In the South Saskatchewan, there's some areas that are really strong. I'm based in Mohkinstsis in the city of Calgary. City of Calgary does have a very extensive watershed monitoring team, and I always sing their praises. They're doing work well beyond the city of Calgary as far as, again, Western data science collection. They do some excellent work on that front. It's still isolated though, right? It's still very concentrated in and predominantly upstream of Calgary. The province, I should say, hasn't done a lot on, say, that riparian area. As far as, say, macrophytes, the plants growing at the edge of the river, mapping, understanding how those are shifting over the years, how they're impacted by flow, that kind of thing has been done very sporadically, I guess is the best way to put it. And it's often relying on outside partners to conduct it, right? Whether that be academics, whether that be community organizations, water stewardship groups. Alberta somewhat uniquely really heavily relies on a lot of these watershed stewardship groups to complete some of their, to fill in the gaps, I guess, on a lot of this, which provides some really interesting opportunities for kind of that community input, but also can lead to some challenges with consistency.
Section 60 of the Municipal Government Act says very, very clearly that municipalities have direction, control, and management of all the water bodies, which includes all the wetlands, streams, creeks, everything, drainage courses, within the municipal boundaries. But the big rider here is the beginning of that Section 60 says subject to every other enactment. An enactment is a federal or a provincial law or regulation. So look at all the federal, provincial laws and regulations dealing with water. What's left for municipalities to have direction, control, and management of? Even things like boating, they don't have regulatory authority to deal with. Yes, municipalities could do something. They could look at all the tools that they have available to them to protect the water bodies through land use management. Section 60 could be translated, married to the planning provisions in Part 17 of the NGA. What we have to do is start looking at ecosystem management, start seeing ourselves on the landscape. If we see ourselves as an embodiment of the water, we're born with water, a certain amount. We're all finitely married to a finite water system. It's no more is being made. This is it. If we start seeing ourselves as integrated right into the water management system, how absolutely critical it is that every drop counts, then we may start to get on the right path to managing how we use the land, how that impacts our water, and how our cumulative population economic growth is having tremendous negative impacts on the very, very system that sustains our ability to survive as a species.
When we think about biodiversity loss, you could think about it both spatially and temporally. So spatially, it's important to have intact ecosystems, big areas of them, but it's also important to have connected ecosystems. A really great data source I always go to, the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. They have really great layered data that you can visualize on a map that shows all of Alberta. 30% of, I think, Alberta is impacted by human footprint. And that is largely concentrated in Southern Alberta, where agriculture and cropland dominates. Only 30% is human footprint. You can see on the map visually that human footprint extends to every point in the province, which means that we are fragmenting habitat. So that's one of the ways we've kind of lost biodiversity. And then on a time scale, you can also look to species and species populations. So some of the species we have that we think of as bio indicators. So these are species that are really intimately tied to the ecosystem that they're in. Their health reflects the health of an ecosystem. We're seeing declines in their populations. The bull trout in Alberta is Alberta's trout, and it used to be one of the most populous fish species in our river systems. And now the bull trout is a threatened species. It's increasingly on a decline. And one of its kind of major threats is the fragmentation of its habitat, which means its streams and rivers are getting chopped off. And then it's also the degradation of its habitat. When we look to this sort of like increasing habitat loss and fragmentation and the species decline, we know that we've lost biodiversity in these ways. It has really real implications. So I think a lot of people will think, well, what does it matter if we lose one fish species? The bull trout is one fish species, but it's emblematic of a whole ecosystem. If its health is declining, if its health in our headwater streams and in our southern tributaries, if it's not there, it indicates that our southern tributaries are suffering. It shows that we really need to do something to repair it, because inevitably as ecosystems work, it'll cascade up that food chain, and we're there at the end, right? Invest in species health is investing in our health.
It's a comprehension problem. We're focusing so much on our own needs. We're not really focusing on the needs of the river. How do you manage this kind of system? We have to be able to predict what the weather's going to do, the variation that we might get in a different year, have some kinds of indicators of whether we're going to have enough water, not have enough water. And then the allocation applies after that. It's not, we're sort of putting the cart before the horse here in terms of allocating rather than having sort of fixed allocations. We might even have consideration for not so much irrigation, for instance, or we may actually want to change the crops we're growing and the extent to which we're actually growing crops. So I think we have to look at a much more comprehensive idea of what's really happening here.
If you think about this area, it's an area that has these really rich soils because they had thousands of years of native grass growth that enriched the soils. So these soils look and appear as if they would be good to grow crops, but limiting factor has always been precipitation. It's always been water. So irrigation was the solution to that. But we're now using this massive input of water every year to sustain crops in this region. We're growing crops that are water heavy. They consume a lot of water. So we're not growing drought tolerant crops. We're forcing crops to grow where they wouldn't naturally grow at the expense of our rivers. The argument will be that irrigated agriculture is this massive part of our agricultural industry, but a little bit more than 5% of all agricultural land is irrigated. And yet they have 44% of the water licenses in Alberta. In 2022, 1/5 of the water we used in Alberta went to 5% of these irrigated lands. The majority of our agricultural economy comes from our dryland crops. We're moving so much water onto these irrigated acres to grow food that we don't even necessarily eat. Is where we're irrigating now appropriate, knowing we're heading into this future where water scarcity and water security are going to become much more common? We do have to start managing our water like it is this commonly held public good, but it's really difficult in the current system we have because right now water is primarily held by a small minority of licenses that have held that water for a really long time. So trying to figure out how we move forward, it's very difficult.